Hello, my name is Allan Hardy. I am with the Division of Gastroenterology at Augusta Health, and I'm going to be talking to you today about low carb and keto eating styles. A little bit of background. I am a gastroenterologist, but I did get certified in obesity medicine in 2018. So I've been using this eating style with many of my patients, including myself. I'm also a patient. So this is what I'm going to cover for you today, these three areas. So number one, what does low carb or keto really mean? I'll talk about the difference between doing low carb or a ketogenic diet, examples of low carb meals. Number two, who should consider a low carb diet? Is this for everybody? Should all of us be on it? And I'll look at some of the diseases that actually improve with about 5 to 10% of total body weight loss. Because this is usually when you hear people talking about wanting to do low carb because they want to lose some of their excess weight. Number three, I will talk about the history of low carb versus low fat. I'll cover what the healthiest diets are based on the science that we have. And then what diets or eating styles have been the best for weight loss. And then finally, I'll talk about the fear of fat. So what does low carb really mean? When we talk about limiting carb intake or sugar intake, if you eat fewer carbs, you're going to have to eat more protein and fat. Now, the traditional way of losing weight was to cut calories, but this generally does not work for long-term or sustained weight loss. There are a lot of reasons for that. Number one, nobody is generally going to just select to starve themselves forever, right? So you can eat fewer calories, you can drop to 1,000 or 800 calories a day, and you'll lose weight, but eventually you're going to start eating again. And if you don't know how to eat healthy, the weight's going to come right back. Another thing that happens is that there are a lot of hormones in the background, okay? So, for example, it's not just calories in, calories out. That's the old way of thinking. We used to think that that mantra is what we should be living by. The problem, though, is that if you go a long period of time, there's a chemical or protein or a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is secreted from the stomach, and it goes to the brain, and it makes you want to eat. We call it the hunger hormone. There's another hormone that actually comes from your fat. Yes, believe it or not, your fat actually secretes hormones, and it communicates with your brain. So fat will secrete a hormone called leptin. Leptin goes to the brain, and it's your brain's way of taking inventory to find out how much energy stored on your body you have. Because keep in mind, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans were dying from starvation and from famine. So your brain wants to make sure that at all costs, you don't die from famine. So if your brain senses that leptin levels are decreasing, your appetite will increase to make sure that you don't die from famine. So how about exercise when we talk about health and weight loss? Well, exercise is very important for cardiovascular health, but it's a very inefficient way to lose excess weight. Obesity medicine experts generally agree about 80 to 90% of weight loss is actually based on what you're eating. And if you think about that, that makes sense. So if humans had to migrate around the world, if people were building log cabins, if people lost weight really easily, the human race would have just died off a long time ago. So the human body becomes very efficient when we start exercising. Now, low carb eating styles have been around for decades, but they really became more popular in the late 1990s and the early 2000s because of Atkins. And that's actually when I got into it because I used to be on a low fat diet. So low carb does not mean eating no carbs. It does not mean eating bacon all day, every day. A lot of people think that. They hear low carb, they think you're just going to be eating bacon and meat, and it's a lot more than that. Now, some obesity medicine doctors go by total carbs, and you'll hear other people talk about net carbs. Myself, I go by net carbs. So here's the formula. Total carbs minus fiber equals net carbs. The reason I go by net carbs is because I want my patients, as a gastroenterologist, I want them to be focused and be aware of the fiber in the foods that they're eating, because there are a lot of healthy benefits of eating fiber. Now, if you want to do keto, that means you have to go really, really low carb. So if you're counting total carbs, that would be less than 50 grams of total carbs. That would get you per day. That would get you into ketosis, or that would be considered doing keto. If you're counting total carbs, 51 to 130 grams of total carbs would be just a low carb diet. Now for my patients, again, I go by net carbs. So less than 20 grams of net carbs would be a ketogenic diet. Some people will go into ketosis if they drop below 30. But just about everybody, by the time you get to less than 20 net carbs, you're going into ketosis, which just means you're burning fat, which is what you want to do if you want to lose excess weight, right? Now, 21 to 70 grams of net carbs is considered just a regular low carb meal. Now, I have an example here on the bottom right. This is an avocado. So one serving of that avocado has 6 grams of total carbs. Maybe you can see it right there. That one serving has 5 grams of fiber. 6 minus 5 is 1. So this serving of avocado would have 6 total carbs, but only 1 net carb. Now, from that last slide, you probably realize what I'm about to say now, that there's no agreed upon definition for low carb. So when I do low carb, I'm eating less than 40 or 50 net carbs a day. But if somebody says they're doing low carb, the question is it total or is it net? Are they doing keto or are they up around 70 or 80 net carbs a day? So it makes it hard to compare studies because people want to compare low carb versus low fat, low carb versus Mediterranean, low carb versus low calorie. And the studies don't really match up very well because everybody defines low carb differently in their studies. Now, when carbohydrate intake is low enough, the body turns to other sources of energy. So you're not taking in carbs, you're not taking in enough sugar, your body needs some source of energy. So what does your body do? It starts burning fat. The byproduct of that is called ketones. And that's ketogenesis. This is different from diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetic ketoacidosis occurs in diabetics when their blood sugars are too high. Two different things. Now, people who are doing keto often want to measure their ketones. They want to know if they're in the burning mode, if they're in that fat burning mode. So there are different ketones you can measure. Now, this website here, Keto Mojo, goes into detail, but basically there are 3 that we measure. There's acetoacetate, that's in the urine. Now, you can go to any drugstore, you can buy the little strips, and you can put the urine on the strip, and you can measure to see if you have ketones. But I'm going to warn you, and this happened to me. If you've been doing low carb or keto for a while, the acetoacetate disappears. Those urine strips don't work anymore. So you could be eating low carb, you could be doing a perfect ketogenic diet, but after a while, those strips don't work for you. Acetate is another one. Acetate is found in the air that you breathe out. I actually was going to try to use this in a program we were starting here at Augusta Health. The problem, though, is that COVID-19 happened. So the idea of people coming into the office and blowing into this little meter to measure their ketones suddenly was not a good idea. So we never got it. Next, there's beta hydroxybutyrate. This is the most prevalent and stable ketone body. This is measured in the blood. And so you can actually do like a finger prick and you can see how much of that ketone you have to see if you are in ketosis. So these are examples of low carb diets. So on the left, this is what people think eating low carb or keto is. Just a plate full of bacon, right? But what it really is closer to what you see there on the right. A nice salad, maybe some feta cheese, a little piece of salmon. Here's some other ideas of low carb. So there's vegetarian low carb. You can see a salad with steak, the avocados for some healthy fats there. And then you have a nice omelet. All 3 of these are low carb or ketogenic meals. Now, you're not going to go into ketosis in one meal. It'll take a couple of days. But this is how you would do it. For lacto-ovo vegetarians, they can have dairy products and egg. You can have a keto avocado pie. You see this nice salad here on the left. So what I like about low carb is that you can apply it to whatever eating style you enjoy. So who should consider a low carb diet? Should everybody do this? Well, let's think about it. About 70% of America has overweight or obesity as a diagnosis. So about 30% of America doesn't really need low carb to be healthy. But if you have a diagnosis of obesity, meaning a body mass index greater than 30, and then if you're a man, a waist circumference greater than 40 inches, I'm close. Or if a woman has a waist circumference greater than 35 inches, and you have any of these health issues right here, diabetes type 2, hypertension, fatty liver, acid reflux, osteoarthritis, hyperlipidemia. There are a lot of others, but I just wanted to put some of the biggies right here, okay? Because a lot of people are suffering from this. And this is the thing about a low carb diet. It doesn't take a lot of weight loss to improve your health. So look at these conditions right here. If you have high blood pressure, you would need to lose about 5 to 15% of your total body weight to see improvement. Fatty liver, a little bit more than 5 to 10%. Osteoarthritis, so you've got bad knees. Osteoarthritis, about 5 to 10%. Obstructive sleep apnea, if you want to get a better night's sleep, okay, greater than 7 to 11%. That's not a lot of weight loss. And it's easily doable with a low carb diet. Now, I mentioned before that low carb diets really gained their popularity more recently, like in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So a lot of people started doing studies to see, is it better than a low fat diet? So you see here, this top line, 2003, it's like Samaha, 132 people in the study. The people on the low fat diet lost 1.9 kilograms in 6 months. People on the low carb diet lost 5.8. So the people on the low carb diet lost 3.9 kilograms more than the people on the low fat diet. And study after study started coming back showing that people on the low carb diet were losing more. The problem with that, of course, is that skeptics said, well, you know what? That's only 6 months. Nobody wants to make recommendations for their patient based on a 6-month study. So this study came out in 2008, New England Journal of Medicine. And in this study, they compared a low carb diet, which is in blue, this blue triangle here, with a Mediterranean style diet, this orange square, and then this red diamond, that was the low fat diet. Now this study showed us two important things. The first thing it showed us was that whatever dietary intervention that you implemented on a patient, most of that weight loss occurred in the first 6 months. So you see here on the timeline, the x-axis, whenever I look at these graphs, I think of y-axis, y points to the sky. So the other one is the x. So if we look at the x-axis here, we count out to 6 months. Within 6 months, most of the weight was lost at that point. And then people kind of stabilized and got into this maintenance phase for the next year and a half. So the first thing it showed us was that most of the weight you're losing is in the first 6 months. The next thing it showed us was that you see over here at the end, people on the low carb and the Mediterranean style diet lost the most weight. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. So why do low carb diets and doing keto, why does that work? So let's first look at what happens when you eat a meal. Now I'm a gastroenterologist, so when you're studying for your gastro board exam, you take all these courses and you're in these books and you read all these volumes of information. We know that gastric emptying studies, and many of you have had a gastric emptying test, but these gastric emptying tests show us that fat and protein will sit in the stomach longer than carbs. So when you eat a fat and a protein, you feel full for a longer period of time. If you eat something that's sugary or a lot of carbs, it empties out of your stomach really fast. So let's look at this graph over here. There are a lot of colorful lines here. Pay attention to the red line. So if you look at the red line, that is a low-fat solid meal. So at time 0, the person eats this low-fat meal, and you see this red line start to go down. So this is the amount of time it's taken for that meal to empty out of your stomach. So it takes about 3 hours for that meal to empty out. Now let's look at a high-fat meal. Same meal, but just with more fat. That's the black line. 2 hours out, almost that entire meal is still sitting right there in your stomach. Well, we've all experienced this. If you've ever had a big juicy ribeye steak at 9 or 10 o'clock at night and you can't fall asleep because you feel like there's a brick sitting right there in your stomach, well, you're right. There is. It's sitting right there. It hasn't moved. But if you're on a low carb ketogenic diet, it allows you to eat that meal high in protein, high in fat, and you don't feel hungry for hours. Look how long it takes for that high fat meal to empty out of the stomach. Over 4 hours compared to the low fat meal. Another thing that science has shown us is that solid meals empty out of the stomach slower than liquid meals. So again, you look here, 30 minutes after a meal, 60 minutes up to 2 hours after a meal. A solid meal, 30 minutes later, it's still sitting right there. It takes 2 hours for that solid meal to empty out, but that liquid meal almost immediately. So if you drink a shake or protein shake or smoothie, as soon as you drink it, it's emptying out. And guess what? You're going to feel hungry a lot sooner. Now, what impact do carbs versus fat have on blood sugar and insulin levels? So if you're diabetic, you really want to pay attention to this. So I'm going to walk you through these two graphs here. So on the left, you see your plasma glucose. That's your blood sugar. Now, many of you, if you have a diagnosis of diabetes, your doctor may have actually given you a glucose tolerance test to see how your body handled a high blood sugar, okay? Did your pancreas secrete insulin to get that sugar out of your blood and distribute it amongst the rest of your body? Because your body knows you're not supposed to have a high blood sugar. So it's trying to secrete insulin. The pancreas is trying to secrete insulin. So in this case, this person was given glucose, basically sugar, and their blood sugar shot up immediately. If you're diabetic, you know you don't want your blood sugar to spike up. Look what happens if you gave that same person a fatty meal. Their blood sugar stabilized, those little black dots. The blood sugar didn't go up. Likewise, when that person's blood sugar went up, what happened with their insulin? Over here in this other graph, the insulin went up. With the fat meal, the insulin barely budged at all. So what we realize is when you eat sugar, when you eat carbs, your blood sugar goes up, then your insulin levels go up. And insulin is a dangerous hormone. Because what does insulin want to do? Insulin wants to get the sugar out of your blood. It brings it down to your liver where it gets stored as glycogen. But when your liver is full, guess where all that sugar goes? It's stored as fat, stored energy. I have too much stored energy right now. So this is what I just said to you. Insulin takes excess glucose out of the bloodstream. Glucose is converted to a form of starch called glycogen, which is stored in the liver and muscle cells. Excess glucose or excess sugar is stored as body fat. Now, we'll talk about the history of low carb versus low fat. And I couldn't figure out which cartoon to use, so I decided to put both of them in there, just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going with this in the next few minutes. This is the other cartoon. I actually like this one. I've used this one before. The caveman with the fast food burger and shake. So why did I use the caveman cartoons? Well, consider that modern man has been around for about 300,000 years. Agriculture, meaning farming, crops, rice, bread, has been around for about 10,000 years. So let's pause. So that means about 290,000 years, humans were walking the earth, modern men and women, people who look like you and me, and they weren't eating bread, they were not eating rice. All right, remember that. Now, sugar began in New Guinea or India, they're not sure, but it began around 500 BC. That was just 2,500 years ago. Pasta began in Italy about 2,000 years ago. How about white potatoes? So when was the last time you had some tasty fast food French fries? White potatoes were introduced to Europe in the early 1500s. So think about Columbus, 1492, sailed the ocean blue, went down to Peru, got the white potato, brought it back to Europe. They didn't really know what to do with it because it didn't have a lot of flavor. So it sat around for about 100 years. And then in Belgium, they were frying fish in a French style method. Well, during the winter months, they realized it was easier to cut up a potato into the shape of a fish and fry that in the French style method. So then they had French fried potatoes. And when they got to America, because you know we got to change everything up, we started making them thinner and it just became French fries. And eventually we got it so small and narrowed down, it became a potato chip. But white potatoes have only been around in use like that for about 500 years. How about the Cadbury Chocolate Company? Now, we just had Valentine's Day. How many of you actually have chocolate at home right now? Cadbury Chocolate Company was established in 1824. That's just 200 years ago. And finally, McDonald's was founded in 1940, less than 100 years ago. So why am I saying all of this to you? Because you have to consider that the problem we have with the obesity epidemic right now is that our genes don't match up well with our current environment. There's a mismatch. Our genes are based on how we were living 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago. But life has changed a lot just in the past 500 or 600 years for us in terms of what we eat and the way we eat it. So this is the other point. Prior to 10,000 years ago, almost all humans ate low carb because unless you stumbled across a beehive or you found a bush of berries or found some fruit and had to climb the tree to get it, there was really nowhere else to get sugar from. Now, the fear of fat. This is really interesting. So Ansel Keys was a researcher. He produced or put out something called the 7-country study. This was published in 1978. Keys felt that diabetes, heart disease, and obesity were due to fat. Now, there are other researchers who disagreed with him. Campbell and Cleve published Diabetes, Coronary Thrombosis, and the Saccharin Disease, suggesting that diabetes and heart disease were really a refined carbohydrate disease, meaning white flour, white sugar, processed man-made foods. The problem is that Keys actually hid some data that did not support this theory and was eventually awarded a position on the nutrition committee for the American Heart Association. At the time, they didn't know that he had hid some of the data. They figured it out later, but the damage was already done. Now he was working with the American Heart Association. They started recommending a low-fat diet. This was in the late 70s. And if you were around in the 80s or 90s, that's all you heard, right? Low fat, low fat, low fat. And the processed food companies were more than happy to give us low fat foods. They would remove the fat, they would put in sugar and salt. There's actually a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat. It explains how they did that starting back in the 50s and 60s. Really scary. But this is what happened to the American population when they did that. You can look at this line right here. The blue line, that represents obesity. So you see us trucking along. We weren't doing a great job, but it wasn't too bad. And then right here, the late 90s happens, start talking about the fear of fat and you should eat low fat and fat free. And you see the obesity epidemic starts to pick up right there. And it goes up and up and up and up and up. Same thing with severe obesity. It starts the same thing. And there are graphs that look at childhood obesity, pediatric obesity. Same thing happens there. It all goes back to that late 70s era when we started talking about you should eat low fat. Well, here's the question. Is fat really bad, right? Is that fake news, right? All you hear about is fat is bad, fat is bad. Well, one of the biggest studies that's come out in the past decade was the PREDIMED study. This was a 2013 study conducted in Spain. It showed a 29% reduction for major cardiovascular events, meaning heart attacks and strokes. But here's the thing. Mediterranean style diet is not a low fat diet. Fat intake was actually increased from 39% to 42%. So what does a Mediterranean style diet look like? So here's an example, right? So you see heavily plant-based, lots of vegetables and fruits, then fish. And actually there are studies now saying that specifically a pesco Mediterranean diet, meaning fish-based Mediterranean diet, is probably the healthiest. Then you have some chicken and cheese and yogurt, and then smaller quantities of red meat and sugar and sweets, right? So I'm supposed to be the low carb keto guy. Why am I talking to you about a Mediterranean diet? Here's why. Because I told you earlier, I warned you, you can apply low carb to any eating style. So if you want to be on the healthiest diet, but you need to lose a few more pounds, how do you do that? Well, and this is Dr. Ingfeld's website, dietdoctor.com. Here's the thing. If you limit grains and below ground vegetables, and you replace that with above ground vegetables, and then people often tell me, well, what do you eat on a low carb diet? Well, you can have lettuce, cucumber, cabbage, cauliflower, zucchini, kale, but this is how you do low carb. But I know a lot of people are saying, well, no, I've heard that fat is bad. People told me that it's gotta be bad. Prove to me that it's not bad. Well, I'm gonna agree with you a little bit. Yes, man-made fats, trans fats are bad, but healthy fats are healthy. So which fats are the bad trans fats and which fats are the healthy good fats? Well, here's an example. So trans fats, these are fats you should avoid. Whereas my grandparents would have said, if man made it, it's probably not that good. If God made it, it's probably okay. So let's look at the trans fats, the ones that man made. Well, we've got fried foods like donuts, baked goods, frozen pizza, cookies, margarine. Those are bad fats. How about healthy fats, the ones that God made? Well, olive oil, fish, flaxseed, nuts and seeds, and avocados. Those are all healthy fats. A little bit more information on what a low-fat diet can actually do for you if you're not careful. So this was the Women's Health Initiative, and you can look this up online. This was a $700 million study. It took place over 8 years. They studied 50,000 women, and the results, participants who kept a low-fat diet did not have fewer instances of cancer. A low-fat diet provided a 26% increased risk for people with a heart condition to suffer from a heart attack or stroke. Now, I showed you this graph already, but I wanted to bring it back to you because a lot of times people are just worried about what's happening on the outside when they lose weight. And that's great. You know, everybody wants to look good. But what I really want to show you is what's going on the inside. Many of you might have had a test called a CRP done before. Top left box here, C-reactive protein. And we'll order it a lot of times because it gives us an idea of how much inflammation is going on in the body. Here you can see people on a low carb diet, that's the blue triangle, they had the biggest drop in their CRP level, meaning the level of inflammation in their body decreased the most. And we think this might have to do with the fact that if you're on a low carb, a low carb diet and you're eating less sugar, many studies suggest can be inflammatory. So for example, we know that high fructose corn syrup causes more inflammation in the liver. So if I have a patient with bad liver disease, the first thing I tell them is don't drink alcohol or drink a lot less. The second thing I tell them though is reduce the amount of high fructose corn syrup in your diet. Finally, and if you're diabetic, it's almost over, but I put this in here specifically for you. So this was a study that came out, or a paper that was put out in 2015. Dietary carbohydrate restriction is the first approach in diabetes management, critical review and evidence-based. So who in the world would use a low-carb diet solely for the treatment of diabetes? Like, who could take this position? Well, let's see. Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Duke University, Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center, Ohio State University. So a lot of really smart people looked at the data and realized, wait a second, we should be treating diabetes with a low-carb diet. Now, in this paper, they made 12 points. I'm not going to go over all 12 points, but I picked out 2 or 3 key ones. So number one, point one, hyperglycemia or high blood sugar is the most salient feature of diabetes. Dietary carbohydrate restriction has the greatest effect on decreasing blood glucose levels. Point number 4, although weight loss is not required for benefit, no dietary intervention is better than carbohydrate restriction for weight loss. Point 6, replacement of carbohydrate with protein is generally beneficial. And I have this graph here because if you're diabetic, you know that your doctor is probably checking a hemoglobin A1C because it gives us an average of what your blood sugars have been for maybe the last 2 or 3 months. Well, people on a low-calorie diet, that's the red box here, their A1C came down a little bit. But look at the people on and that stands for very low-carb ketogenic diet. People on a very low-carb ketogenic diet, their A1C came down dramatically. They had dramatic improvement in their A1C. And I'm not going to read this whole paragraph over here, but this HPLCD, high protein, low carb diets, have a more favorable effect on weight loss, body composition, resting metabolic rate, and cardiovascular risk than fat reduced diets. So take home points. You made it through the talk. I'm sorry it was so long, but I really wanted to get this information to you. Current scientific evidence supports a Mediterranean-style diet as the healthiest eating style. Current scientific evidence supports low-carb eating styles to promote weight loss. These should no longer be considered fad diets as they have been shown to lower triglycerides, improve or cure diabetes, and improve liver health. And there's studies right there if you want to look them up online by Hallberg, Sophie and Cassini, and Westman. I actually met Sarah Hallberg at a conference a few years ago. She helped me develop my program. She probably doesn't even know. And then I actually shadowed Dr. Eric Westman down at Duke last year. Smart people, and I've learned a lot from them, so I have to give them credit for that. And finally, is meat healthy? Well, I think this is a bad question. They tell you that there's no such thing as a bad question. I disagree. This is the wrong question. The question is not, is meat healthy? I think the question should be, are you eating healthy meat? Okay, so when they do these studies and they come back and they say, well, people who eat meat have all these diseases, the question is, what kind of meat are these people eating? Was it processed meat or was it red meat? Because they lump them together. And then if it's red meat, especially out here in rural Virginia, was it a grass-fed cow or was it corn-fed? So we could get more marbling and more fat. Was it injected with hormones? Was it injected with antibiotics? Or is it like a processed hot dog or some burger that you have with fries and a shake when you stop on the side of 64? So those are all 3 different types of meat. So I think you have to think about that when they start saying meat is bad. So I think the question is, are you eating healthy meat? That's the bigger question. And again, with a Mediterranean style diet, you can have some red meat, just in small quantities. Anyway, I hope you made it to the end. I hope you got something out of this lecture.